A magnificent bull was shot in the leg by a poacher, left to die, until the young man who loved it came to save it. What happens next will leave you speechless. The sharp, muffled crack split the morning air like a whip. Elias Dorn's head snapped toward the sound, his fingers tightening around the metal handle of the grain bucket until it bit into his palm. That was no branch breaking in the wind, no hammer striking in the barn. It was the sound of a rifle. Before his mind could even form the thought, a bellow followed, deep and raw, echoing across the paddock. The voice was unmistakable. Bramble. The bucket clanged against the grass as Elias dropped it, grain spilling out in a messy arc. His legs were already moving, boots thudding against the damp soil, pushing through the cold morning mist that swirled around his knees. The paddock fence loomed ahead, blurred by the white haze, and beyond it, he could see a dark, heaving shape on the ground. When he reached the far edge, his breath caught in his throat. Bramble, the massive black-coated bull that had been his shadow since he was 12, lay on his side in the wet grass. His great head tossed weakly, nostrils flaring as his legs twitched in a feeble attempt to rise. A dark stain spread down his left foreleg, the blood soaking into the dew-heavy earth. Elias's stomach twisted. He dropped to his knees beside the bull, ignoring the mud seeping into his trousers. His hands hovered for a moment, unsure whether touching the wound would hurt more than help. Up close, he could see it clearly, a small, perfectly round hole in the muscle just above the knee joint. No ragged tearing, no splintered bone showing. This was a clean shot. Precise. This wasn't an accident, Elias muttered under his breath, the words barely escaping before his jaw clenched shut. Bramble's breathing came in short, huffing bursts, his dark eyes rolling toward Elias. There was trust there, but also pain. Too much pain for the animal to mask. Elias swallowed hard and rested a steadying hand on Bramble's neck. "Easy, boy. Easy. I'm here." He forced himself to take in the rest of the scene. The fence nearby was undamaged, but the grass beyond it told a different story. It was pressed flat in a narrow line, leading away from the paddock toward the ridge beyond the farm. The prints were uneven in places, as if the person had been moving quickly but still trying to stay low. Something caught his eye near the fence post. Half buried in the mud was the glint of metal. He reached for it and pulled free a spent rifle casing, still faintly warm against his fingers. A fresh shot. The shooter was close, maybe too close. His mind darted to the farmhouse where his father, Owen Dorn, would just be starting his morning coffee. The thought of Owen seeing Bramble like this, helpless, bleeding, tightened something in Elias's chest. Owen had built his livelihood on this farm, and Bramble wasn't just a bull to him. He was a living investment, a bloodline worth more than most people's land. But Elias wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the way Bramble had followed him around the yard as a calf, the way the bull would nudge him with his massive head when he thought Elias was taking too long to bring feed. He couldn't let whoever had done this get away. Yet every moment he stayed here was a moment Bramble's wound bled. His mind warred with itself, run to the barn for the veterinary kit, or go after the poacher while the trail was still fresh. A faint movement in the tree line made the decision for him. A shadow slipped between the trunks, there for an instant and gone again. Elias's heart leapt. The poacher hadn't fled far. The casing in his pocket felt heavier, almost like proof of the challenge waiting ahead. He leaned closer to Bramble, speaking low and urgent. "I'll be back, I promise. Hold on for me." Bramble's ear flicked faintly at the sound of his voice, and Elias took that as his answer. Rising quickly, he scanned the field one more time, noting the path of the flattened grass and the direction of the shadow. He could still catch them if he moved fast, but as he vaulted over the fence, he couldn't shake the thought gnawing at the back of his mind. If the shooter had come for Bramble, what was to stop him from coming back? Elias's boots sank into the damp soil with each careful step, the cold morning air sharp in his lungs. His eyes swept the ground in front of him, reading the faint signs the way his father had taught him years ago. Here, a bent stem of grass angled toward the ridge. There, a snapped twig still oozing sap. The trail was fresh, minutes old at most. Whoever had fired the shot had passed through here not long before. He moved along the overgrown hedgerow, his fingers brushing the damp leaves as he kept low. Bramble's distant calls still drifted across the fields behind him, weaker now but still there. Each sound felt like a pull on Elias's chest, reminding him he was leaving the bull behind with no help. He told himself it was only for a little while. He would find the man responsible, stop him from coming back, and return before it was too late. The trail veered toward the old logging road, the same path Owen had once used to haul timber when the mill was still open. Now it was nothing more than two faded ruts between thick weeds. Elias followed it for several yards before frowning. The prints ahead didn't make sense. The boot marks stopped, angled back toward the hedgerow, and then reappeared farther up the path. a deliberate loop. The man was trying to throw off anyone following. Elias crouched, running a hand over one of the fresher prints. The weight distribution told him the man had been moving quickly, but not running. He was confident enough to believe no one was on his trail. Elias's jaw tightened. This wasn't some drifter or desperate hunter. Whoever it was knew the land and was taking steps to hide. A flicker of movement caught the edge of his vision. Through a gap in the brush, a figure in a brown coat appeared ahead, walking with a purposeful stride and a rifle slung over one shoulder. Elias dropped into a crouch, his breath slowing as he studied the man's gait. The shooter was taller than him, broad in the shoulders, head turning slightly from side to side as if checking the tree line. Elias stayed low, shadowing him at a distance. The man's boots crunched softly against the packed earth until, without warning, he turned sharply off the road and slipped into a concrete opening half hidden by ivy, the entrance to the old irrigation tunnels beneath the ridge. Elias's pulse jumped. The tunnels were a maze of dark, echoing corridors, their purpose long abandoned after the water routes had dried up. Following inside meant more than just keeping sight of the man. It meant risking getting lost or cornered. He paused at the entrance, the damp, cool air spilling out to meet him. From somewhere deep inside, footsteps echoed, joined by the faint scrape of metal on stone. Elias stepped in quietly, his boots finding the dry patches between puddles. The dim light from the opening faded with each turn until he was moving through shadow, the smell of wet stone and rust filling his nose. A voice drifted back toward him, low, muttering, and sharp-edged. "This'll send him a message." The tone made Elias stop cold. This wasn't about food. It wasn't a hunter taking a shot at a stray bull. The words were laced with something personal, anger, maybe hatred. Elias edged closer until the tunnel widened into a chamber lit by a single shaft of light filtering through a broken grate. The man in the brown coat stood at the base of a rusted ladder, looking up toward the exit above. As Elias shifted to get a better view, the light fell across the man's face. Recognition struck like a blow. Marek Voss. Elias's breath caught. Marek had lived just beyond the southern fence for years, and he and Owen had been at odds for as long as Elias could remember, fighting over property lines, grazing rights, and water access. Marek had accused the Dorns of stealing from his land more than once. Owen had called him a liar. Before Elias could move, another shape emerged from the shadows. Taller than Marek by a head, shoulders like stone, a deep scar cutting across his jaw. He carried a long, rectangular case in one hand, holding it with the kind of ease that suggested whatever was inside was heavy and familiar. "You sure he'll take the bait?" the scarred man asked, his voice low but carrying in the tunnel's stillness. "He'll come running," Marek replied, his mouth curling into something between a sneer and a smile. "Always does when that bull's in trouble. This time, he won't walk away." Elias's stomach twisted. They weren't talking about Bramble as an animal. They were talking about him as leverage. This was a trap, one meant to draw Owen into danger. The scarred man shifted the case in his grip. "Then we finish it tonight?" "Tonight," Marek said. "Once it's dark, we'll go back and make sure the beast doesn't get back up. By then, Owen will be there, and we'll handle him too." Elias's pulse hammered in his ears. The thought of them returning, of Bramble bleeding out before he could stop it, ignited something in him. He wanted to run now, to sprint back to the farm and warn Owen, but he forced himself to stay still. If he left, they might disappear into the hills and carry out their plan anyway. If he followed, he might learn where they were staying, maybe even catch them unprepared. The two men started climbing the ladder, their boots clanging against the rusted rungs. Elias waited until the sound faded above before creeping forward, testing each step so it wouldn't echo. The tunnel smelled stronger here, a mix of damp stone and old iron. His mind worked furiously. Following them meant risking exposure, but letting them go meant risking everything. He tightened his grip on the spent casing still in his pocket, the metal warm from his hand. The decision formed in his chest like a weight settling into place. He had only one chance, to follow them farther and learn exactly what they intended. By dusk, Elias had trailed Marek and the scarred man into the depths of Glenridge Woods, the last orange light of the sun filtering weakly through the skeletal branches overhead. The forest was quiet in a way that felt wrong. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, just the crunch of his boots against the cold, brittle carpet of leaves. Through the thinning trunks ahead, a faint plume of smoke curled lazily into the dimming sky. His breath slowed as he crept closer, the sharp tang of wood smoke mingling with the damp scent of the forest floor. The hunting cabin appeared suddenly, hunched low between two mossy boulders as if hiding from the world. Its roof sagged under years of weather, but a pale, flickering glow leaked out from behind the boarded windows. Elias crouched behind a fallen log, his eyes scanning the clearing for movement. He saw no one outside, but he knew better than to assume it was empty. He moved forward in slow, deliberate steps, placing each boot between patches of leaves to avoid their brittle crunch. At the cabin wall, he pressed himself flat against the rough wood, inching toward a narrow gap in the boards. The smell of damp timber and smoke grew stronger here, mixing with something acrid, gun oil. Peering through the slit, his pulse quickened. Inside, the dim interior was lit by a single lantern set on a scarred wooden table. Papers and maps were spread out haphazardly, their edges weighed down by stones and empty mugs. Against the far wall, several large sheets of paper were pinned, each one a map of Ashridge Farm. Black charcoal marks dotted the grazing fields, the hedgerows, and even the access points along the southern fence. Then his eyes landed on one map that was different. A bold circle was drawn around Bramble's paddock, the word trap scrawled beside it in thick, jagged letters. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just about hurting the bull. The paddock was a lure, a way to pull Owen into the open. The message Merrick had muttered about in the tunnels wasn't meant for Elias. It was meant for his father. A floorboard groaned inside, and Elias's gaze shifted. Merrick was at the table, bent over the maps, his fingers tracing along the lines of the property. The scarred man stood near the door, the long case from earlier now open on a bench beside him. Inside, metal gleamed, too much of it for just one weapon. Elias's mind raced. Two armed men, familiar with the land, with a plan designed to put Owen directly in their sights. Backing away from the gap, Elias's heel brushed against a root, and he froze. No sound from inside. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think clearly. Charging in was suicide, but leaving them free to act was just as dangerous. That's when he remembered the old service road that looped behind the cabin. If he could disable their vehicle, they'd be stranded long enough for him to get help, or at least prepare a counterattack. The idea took hold quickly, and he moved around the side of the cabin, careful to keep to the shadows where the light from inside couldn't touch him. Behind the cabin, beneath a sagging tarp, sat a rusted pickup. Its once green paint had faded to the dull color of moss, and the tires sagged slightly under their own weight. Still, the faint sheen on the hood suggested it had been used recently. Elias crouched, pulling the small pocketknife from his coat. His fingers shook, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that he was working only yards from men who would likely shoot him on sight. He slid under the truck, the cold earth pressing into his back. The smell of oil and old gasoline clung to the undercarriage. Finding the fuel line, he sawed at it quickly but carefully, every scrape of metal on rubber sounding far too loud in the stillness. A thin stream of fuel leaked into the dirt, darkening the soil beneath him. Just as he sheathed the knife, a floorboard creaked inside the cabin, louder this time, closer to the back door. Elias's heart lurched. He rolled out from under the truck and pressed himself flat against its side, his breath shallow. The door swung open with a groan. The scarred man stepped out, his broad frame filling the doorway. His eyes swept the tree line, his jaw tightening as if he sensed something out of place. He took 2 slow steps forward, the crunch of leaves under his boots sounding like hammer blows in Elias's ears. Elias's back was cold against the metal of the truck. He gripped the edge of the wheel well, ready to dart if the man came closer. The scarred man's head tilted slightly, his gaze lingering in the shadows where Elias crouched. Elias could see the faint white line of the scar across his jaw, the way his hand rested casually, but not idly, on the butt of a pistol at his hip. Then, from inside, a loud crash echoed, something heavy falling against the table. "Leave it! I've got it!" Merrick's voice called, irritated. The scarred man hesitated, gave the tree line one last sweeping look, then turned back toward the cabin. The door closed behind him. Elias didn't waste another second. He pushed away from the truck and slipped into the darkness at the edge of the clearing, his steps quick but silent. The cold air burned in his lungs as he put distance between himself and the cabin. By the time he reached the first thinning of the trees, night had fallen completely. The moon hung low, its pale light barely filtering through the branches. The walk back to the farm felt longer than the chase had, each step carrying the weight of what he had seen. When the lights of the farmhouse finally came into view, Elias broke into a jog. The barn loomed dark and silent, but inside the paddock, Bramble still lay in the grass, shifting weakly. The bull's breathing was heavy now, each rise and fall of his flank slow and strained. Owen was waiting at the gate, his broad shoulders tense. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. Elias didn't answer right away. He caught his breath, then told his father everything, about the cabin, the maps, the word trap, and the plan to return that night. He saw Owen's jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing in a way that told Elias the anger wasn't just about Bramble anymore. When Elias finished, Owen nodded slowly. Then we don't wait for them to make the first move. Elias met his father's gaze, the weight of the unspoken agreement passing between them. Together they formed a plan, not just to save Bramble, but to turn the trap back on the poachers. Before dawn, the air was cold enough to sting the lungs. Mist curled low across the paddock, softening the edges of the fence and the scattered hay bales into pale, ghostly shapes. Owen stood in the shadow of the fence, his broad frame still as stone. Beside him, Elias crouched low behind a stack of hay, the damp straw pressing into his coat. Neither spoke. Their breaths rose in faint clouds, blending with the rolling fog. Every few moments, Owen's eyes flicked toward the dark expanse of pasture where Bramble lay in the dewy grass, unmoving. No police had been called. They had agreed, without words, that Ashridge Farm was too far from help for that to matter. By the time any officers arrived, Merrick and his scarred accomplice could be gone, or worse, Owen could be the one lying still in the paddock. This was their land, and tonight they would defend it themselves. Earlier, Owen had worked in silence, fixing a pair of floodlights to the top of the fence posts, their wires trailing to a concealed switch near Elias's position. Beside Owen, a thick coil of chain lay coiled like a steel snake, ready to lock the paddock gate. The plan was simple on paper, but the silence between them carried the weight of all that could go wrong. Hours passed with only the distant rustle of the mist in the grass. Elias's legs began to ache from crouching, but he didn't dare shift. He knew Merrick well enough by now to believe he'd approach like a shadow, silent, deliberate, patient. The stillness became its own kind of pressure, each minute stretching thinner and tighter until the slightest sound could have snapped it. It was Owen who moved first, his head tilted slightly, listening. From somewhere beyond the fog's edge, faint shapes began to form. Two figures, low to the ground, slipping over the fence as if they belonged there. Elias's chest tightened. Even in the pale light of dawn's earliest glow, the dark outlines of rifles were unmistakable. The men paused just inside the paddock, scanning the shadows, their boots sinking softly into the wet earth. They moved with a predator's caution, step by step toward the shape of Bramble lying still near the center of the field. The bull's massive body was motionless, his breathing slow and shallow by design. Earlier, Elias had draped an old feed sack over Bramble's bandaged leg to hide the dressing, making the animal's injury look far worse than it truly was. The poachers reached him, their rifles angled loosely but ready. Merrick knelt first, brushing the edge of the sack aside to inspect the wound. His voice was a low murmur Elias couldn't make out, but the tone carried the confidence of a man who thought victory was moments away. The scarred man stood beside him, glancing toward the tree line, his eyes flicking briefly toward the direction of the farmhouse. From his place behind the hay, Elias's palms had grown slick with sweat despite the cold. He looked to Owen, whose expression was carved from granite. Then, without a sound, Owen gave a single nod. Elias pressed the switch. The paddock exploded with light. The floodlights blazed with a suddenness that split the darkness like fire ripping through dry wood. The mist lit up in a dazzling white haze, every blade of grass stark against the glare. Merrick and the scarred man staggered back instinctively, hands flying to shield their eyes. "Now!" Owen's voice cut sharp through the air. They moved together, Owen charging for the gate while Elias sprang from cover. The wet ground gave under Elias's boots, but he kept pace, heart pounding. The poachers shouted, their voices strained with surprise and sudden fear. The gate clanged shut under Owen's weight, and the chain rattled as he looped it hard through the latch, snapping the padlock closed. Trapped. Merrick swore under his breath and lunged for the fence, but the lights were blinding from every angle. The scarred man spun to run, slipped on the slick grass, and crashed to the ground with a heavy thud. His rifle skidded away, spinning to a stop several feet from his grasp. Elias darted toward it, kicking the weapon farther out of reach before the man could recover. "You won't make it out," Owen barked, his stance square at the gate, one hand gripping the chain like he meant to rip it free if needed. Inside the paddock, Merrick's chest rose and fell with sharp, angry breaths. His head turned toward the fence where his truck would have been waiting, if it weren't for the sabotage the night before. Realization settled over his face like a shadow, the fight in his posture faltering. "You cut the line," he muttered, as if speaking to himself. Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The plan had worked exactly as they'd hoped, and now the danger that had hung over the farm for days was crumbling in the cold morning air. Still, he didn't take his eyes off the scarred man, who was pushing himself up from the grass with slow, deliberate movements. For long minutes, the only sounds were the hum of the floodlights, Bramble's steady breathing, and the occasional metallic clink of the chain as Owen shifted his grip. The poachers shouted threats, but their voices had lost their edge. Words spent by men who had already realized they were beaten. The mist began to lift as the sun broke over the horizon, bathing the field in pale gold. By midday, the growl of an approaching engine reached them. The sheriff's truck rolled into view, its tires crunching over the gravel road. The man who stepped out was broad-shouldered, his weathered face unreadable as he surveyed the scene. In a few curt exchanges, the situation was explained. The sheriff's deputies moved in, unlocking the gate and pulling Merrick and his accomplice out one by one. Cold steel cuffs clicked around their wrists, and the two were led toward the waiting vehicle. Neither looked back. Bramble was quickly examined before being loaded into a trailer bound for the nearest veterinary station. The vet, a gruff man with kind eyes, told Owen and Elias the bull would recover with time and rest. The relief in Owen's shoulders was almost imperceptible, but Elias saw it. Word of the incident spread quickly through the valley. Farmers who had once regarded Elias as just Owen's boy now spoke his name with quiet respect. They understood the risk he had taken, the danger he had faced without flinching. In the days that followed, Elias often found himself by the paddock in the late afternoon, leaning against the fence as the sun dipped low. Bramble, back from the vet and moving with more strength each day, would lumber over, his dark eyes calm and steady. Elias would rest his hand on the bull's massive shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath the hide, the living proof of what they had fought for. He knew they had faced danger together, and that they had both come out stronger. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of cruelty, loyalty, and the unwavering bond between humans and animals. This narrative aims to raise awareness about the impact of poaching, the importance of compassion, and the extraordinary lengths some will go to protect what they love.